Hi guys, welcome back. So, if you haven't realized by now, I'm providing you with audio, but no PowerPoints this semester. Not that I will not for future classes, but what I've realized is that when I provide PowerPoints, people seem to not feel as if the textbook is important. So, in order to get you to actually read the textbook, I am not providing you with PowerPoints for these first 3 chapters, in the hopes that you are actually listening to these audios as you read through the textbook and as I highlight the important information, but you are still reading the textbook. So, that being said, we are going to continue on with some information regarding speech sound acquisition, starting with chapter 3. We're going to go through some theories on sound acquisition, and then finally some typical norms or developmental sequences in terms of sound acquisition, and we'll go from there. Why do we need to know about normal acquisition or typical development? Well, in order to understand if a child is truly disordered, we have to know what typical is. The text actually goes through a nice little analysis in the beginning of the chapter on how understanding of speech sound acquisition affects the referral process, to the assessment process, to the intervention process, and finally what we use to determine how to dismiss or discharge children from services. I think that's very appropriately put there in the first couple of pages of the text. So what we're going to do is now go through some models of speech sound acquisition. The text actually goes through a few. I will highlight some important information and then expect you to get an understanding in general of some of the other models. But we actually start off with a behaviorist model. And then we're going to follow up with some linguistic-based models, as that's where the progression typically has shown. But as I said, a behaviorist model of speech acquisition is where we're going to start. And this really comes from psychology and the idea behind operant conditioning. I'm sure you guys have heard about B.F. Skinner. And Skinner is probably one of the most influential people behind the idea of operant conditioning and behaviorism. And with operant conditioning, you guys know that it's a stimulus-response model. There's a stimulus followed by a response, which then suggests follow-up with more productions. By changing the consequences or the response to what we see, to what a child produces, we can therefore change the way they're going to produce things later on in the future. So basically the overall idea behind this behaviorist model is that sounds that are easy to discriminate, okay, are going to be learned first. So what would make a sound more easily discriminable is visual cues. So obviously sounds that are produced, not obviously, but I'm telling you that sounds are produced in the front of the mouth are typically acquired earlier. Why? Because we can see them. We can see a pa, we can see a ba being made. It also has to do with motor control and neurological development. In order to produce a pa or a ba, you're really using the jaw mainly, and also the lips. The more fine motor control that we see in production of consonants or vowels that require the tongue to move more specifically is later developed. But yeah, so easily discriminable sounds are learned first because of this idea of behaviorist model. So we see it, therefore we produce it. Okay? And also this idea of behaviorism affecting speech acquisition is that, you know, when we were looking at this behaviorist model, as I said earlier in the past century, we did consider speech to be a motor activity, okay? So it's production of these sounds, and obviously the language piece did not come into play as much. The behaviorist model kind of leads to our traditional approach at therapy, or articulation intervention. Traditional therapy, we kind of always go back to Van Riper as probably the father of traditional therapy, where a child is presented with a sound, and then he is required to say it, and then we give them a sticker if they say it correctly. There's your positive reinforcement, your stimulus response. And that's what traditional therapy is. They're expected to produce something, and then we respond to it, either telling them that what they produced was appropriate and we want to see it reinforced and produce more and more, or if the target was not produced appropriately, we want to identify ways in which to get them to thus produce it better in the future. So there's your operant conditioning, your stimulus response theory, your behaviors model, which again goes back to speech acquisition when we thought of speech sound as more motor in theory and articulation based. Well, as the century moved on, we started to look at linguistics, and linguists started to have a say in speech sound acquisition. And the first kind of model that we're going to talk about is that of generative phonology that was developed by Chomsky, really based on the sound structure of language. And the sound structure of language focuses on phonology, okay? He has two main rules or major concepts that kind of underlie his idea of generative phonology. Concept one is that phonological rules map underlying representations onto surface pronunciations. So there's this idea that there's this universal underlying representation on how we are supposed to put sounds together that every child has, and that is going to affect their actual pronunciation of the sounds. The second concept, which really kind of says that semantics and syntax has a play or a role in phonology, is not as widely discussed or researched, but that concept is phonological descriptions depend on information from other linguistic levels. So the semantics, the morphology, is really going to affect the actual phonological production of certain sounds. He really kind of is where we originally got the idea of phonological rules, that there's this underlying representation. A lot of what he talks about is very linguistic based and doesn't necessarily always kind of make itself clinical based or clinically represented. But the idea of general phonology and the idea of specific rules or phonological rules really do begin to start to help explain why certain sounds are substituted for certain sounds, why certain sounds are distorted as opposed to substituted when they're produced incorrectly. So we know that a child who is not producing the TH sound, the sound, is most likely going to substitute it with a F sound, the F sound, in certain aspects. So instead of 3, they say free. Okay, we know that. There's got to be an underlying rule or an underlying systematic representation that is making every child produce it incorrectly that way. And that's kind of the idea behind generative phonology. It explains distortions, omissions, additions, and a whole bunch of other things that children do that we see across the population, right? Every child distorts a sound similarly. Every child adds or substitutes sounds similarly. Not that there aren't exceptions, and there are reasons for those exceptions, but for the most part, we see the majority of the population producing these same error patterns. And that's what generative phonology really started to help key us into. But what happens is we don't really have that theory to practice kind of information from generative phonology. Where we do see theory to practice coming into play a lot more is with the idea of the next model that we're going to discuss, and that's natural phonology. And that's where we start to look at how this theory is going to shape or part information on our assessment and treatment procedures, okay? And natural phonology really lays the foundation for what we know of as phonological processes, okay? And we talked a little bit about that. But natural phonology really says that there are these processes, these patterns, okay? Patterns that are preferred or frequently used, okay? And are universal, okay? So everyone starts to use these patterns, okay? There's a nice quote in here that phonological process is a mental operation that applies in speech to substitute for a class of sounds or sound sequences representing or presenting a common difficulty to the speech capacity of the individual, an alternative class identical but lacking the difficult property. So what does that really mean? Well, a child is supposed to produce one thing and instead produces something else. That something else that they're producing is more easily formulated because what they're intending to produce, they cannot produce. So example of that might be cluster reduction, right? We want the child to say sprite, sprite, okay? And they have to produce a difficult sequence of consonants, s-p-r, to produce the spr consonant cluster. Well, instead, what do they do? They reduce that consonant cluster. They say spite, or srite, or sight instead, okay? They produce it with something more easily formulated, okay? And that's basically what that quote is saying, okay? They do have that underlying idea of what that cluster is, but they know that it's going to be difficult to formulate for some way, or for some reason, and thus they reduce it, okay? And that is universal. All children do that until they're able to produce it correctly. Some children may take longer than others, okay? But there's a developmental sequence, and we know that by a certain age, these processes are going to be eliminated because a child should be able to then produce the appropriate production without problem. Okay? So eventually these processes will be suppressed. Okay? There are some that have been identified. We're going to go through them later on, the different phonological processes that we look for in children, or that children demonstrate, and therefore we document it. But it all comes from this idea of natural phonology. There are some more models that the text goes through: nonlinear phonology, optimality theory, sonority theory. There are important things in these models, the psycholinguistic models that are discussed, but I'm not going to go through a specific discussion of each of them. Again, I want you to read them, take note, understand where you can find information if you have to, but I feel that since we're focusing our class clinically based, I want you to know what's most important in your actual practice on a regular basis, okay? And so we're going to move on to typical speech sound acquisition. Now, how do we know what's typical? The text goes through a description or discussion on different ways in which we can identify appropriate acquisition. Okay, diary studies, large cross-sectional group studies, and finally, longitudinal studies. There are positive and negatives about all of these. So think about a diary study. What's a diary study? Well, I'm a linguist, I'm a speech-language pathologist, and I have a child. And I'm literally going to document every production that my child makes from birth to 5 years old. Okay? And I'm going to publish this information. And we have information like this, okay? We have researchers who have done this, and we gain information from these diary studies. But what do we see? Yes, we see exactly the progression that this one child is making, but that being said, it is one child. So how do we know that that's typical? How do we know that every child is going to go through the same course of acquisition? So, diary studies. We also have large cross-sectional group studies and longitudinal studies, where we look at larger groups of children, but again, the comparison is there How we're taking the data is different. When we do cross-sectional studies, oftentimes we're not seeing these children at every stage of the game. And we know that at this developmental stage, this before 6 or 7 years of age, this critical period, that so much is going on. So if we're not getting information every step of the way, every minute of the day, we may be missing out on large chunks of information. And therefore, we don't have an overall appropriate picture of what we want to talk about. So, please feel free to read through those sections of the chapter. Okay. The next section of the chapter is really going through, starting on page 77, 4 different phases of speech sound acquisition. This is developed by these authors. Other authors come up with similar stages, may have 1 or 2 or 3 stages as opposed to 4 stages. Not 1, really. 3 or 4 is usually where we're at. But looking at vocalization or sound productions of children beginning at birth and going through school age for the most part. In terms of our text, we're looking at phase 1 where the foundation for speech is being laid. Okay? And that's where infants are really starting to play with that those sound productions, okay? Playing with the movement of the mouth, of the articulators to make different sounds, okay? We know that the vocal tract of infants is extremely small, and therefore they can't do as much as adults do. But what can they do? They can breathe, they can suck, and they can swallow, and that's their main purpose, okay? As they develop, they start to use this cavity for speech, or for sound production, I should say, okay? And they start to move the jaw, okay? And the jaw is kind of the first of the articulators to become adult-like in their movements, and then finally the lips, which kind of go along with the jaw, as I said before, in terms of producing front sounds like p and ba and ma. And then finally the tongue and the palate really come into play a little bit later on. Okay? But before we can even start making these motor movements that lead to sounds, children develop discrimination abilities. They develop identification abilities. They can hear the difference, or discriminate the difference, I should say, between 2 different sounds, between 2 different voices. And this starts in the womb, yes, we know that, but it also happens in infancy. And we know this through different techniques that we use, where we do something called high amplitude sucking. Okay, so a child is sucking, 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 and then we present them with a series of sounds, and they continue to suck. And then we change that sound. So we're hearing ba 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 ta ta ta. Okay, once that sound is changed, you see a change in the sucking pattern of that child. And that's how we get a lot of this information that we have on early infant discrimination abilities. Okay? There's nice information on that. But once they're starting to understand or discriminate the different sounds, they start to produce different sounds. Okay? On page 82 of the text, there are 2 different typologies, I guess, in terms of what infant vocalizations that occur, but they're very similar, okay? We start out with reflexive sounds, so those are those vegetative sounds, that crying and grunting types of sounds that sound like pretty much the larynx is just working a little bit and the vocal cords may be coming together, but it's really based on a respiratory process, okay? That's in the first couple of months of life. Then when we get to like 1 to 4 months, a little bit older, there's more of a control that happens, okay? So still, children start playing and it seems a little bit more controlled. They're able to make raspberries, brrr, they play like that, clicks and things such as that. You know, they put consonants, they start to cluster and put consonants with vowels or change the vowels, okay? And then soon enough, right, we start to have what we call as babbling, okay? And that's after, a couple of months, after a few months actually. When we get to like 5 and 6 months, babbling starts to appear. And then they realize that they can change the shapes of the syllables that they're producing. Whereas it was just ba, 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 CV, CV, they could start changing the shapes of those syllables where maybe CVC, or maybe VC, or CCC. And we get complex syllable shapes as we age and start to get around a year. And then finally, by that first year, we really do get their first words, okay? And we really can start distinguishing those first words from babbling because they're consistent. They're consistent. Those productions, those first words are consistently produced, as opposed to babbling where it's kind of random and it changes from time to time. Okay? That is what we're looking at as the first phase, where we laid that foundation. And then, phase 2, according to the book, is where we're transitioning from words to speech. Okay? Words actually start to take on meaning, and children start to develop what we call the first 50 words. And those 50 words are typically based on that foundation that was laid. Okay? So they're very simple syllable shapes using those front consonants and those simple vowels. Okay? So you see ma, or da, or doggy, or cup, or cut. I won't even do the final consonant there. Baba, bottle. Okay, so it's limited in terms of the vowels that they're using. Baba, mama, dada. They're all similar vowels, but we start to expand the syllable shapes, okay? And they're demonstrating some of those phonological patterns that we talked about in terms of those natural phonology that is happening. They will reduplicate, they'll present with final consonant deletion, they'll often cluster reduce, they often add vowels at the end of words that don't necessarily have vowels, so mom becomes mommy, doggy, things like that. Okay? Early consonant inventories, it's good to know that they start with nasal, so you hear a lot of words. Okay, that's why you hear mommy. You'll hear plosives, that's why you hear daddy. Baba, okay? And then we start to develop some more complex things like fricatives and approximates. But it usually starts out with those nasals and plosives, okay? At this point, we're really going more into phase 3, where we start to grow our inventory of speech sounds that we use and combinations of sounds that we use. We're expanding our vowel repertoire, okay? And phase 3 is where we grow our inventory. We use more words. So it's not just the first 50 words, right? This is where our fast mapping and our vocabulary spurt really kind of matches the development of sound acquisition, okay? And the text actually goes into a little discussion, which I'm going to expand upon, of intelligibility, right? So even though kids may still be producing sounds or sound errors, because that's developmental or it may be a little bit of a delay, we at this point want to really talk about whether the child is intelligible or not. And intelligibility, as a brief description here, or direct definition here, where intelligibility is the single most practical measurement of oral communication competence. Well, what does that mean? Intelligibility is making yourself understood. And that's basically the ultimate goal of communication. If we're not understood, then what's the purpose of communicating, right? And the only issue here with intelligibility is it's impacted by so many things. And we often think of it as just a speech sound issue, but it's often impacted by many things. Intelligibility can be compounded by phonological issues, suprasegmental issues. So if phrasing is incorrect, okay? Other linguistic features, if the syntax is off, okay, intelligibility is going to be impacted. Okay? One of the biggest things that I want to start off by saying is intelligibility is something that is difficult to measure. Okay, we do articulation tests, but what do we do when we do an articulation test? It's usually a single word test where we provide them with opportunities to produce one time or a couple of chances of producing each sound in different contexts of a word, but it's usually isolated words. Okay, and we don't have standardized measures necessarily of intelligibility. There's research that says by 4 years old or 5 years old, children should be 100% intelligible. That at 2 years of age, they should only be 50% intelligible. And by 3 years of age, they should be 75% intelligible. Well, these are kind of broad ranges, first of all. And how do we measure that? Well, a lot of people will just kind of guess and approximate the intelligibility. That's not good. We don't want to do that. There are some, I'm not going to call standardized assessments that are out there, but there are more published measures of intelligibility or ways of obtaining intelligibility measures that are available. One is called the BIT, the Beginner's Intelligibility Test, okay? And we're going to go over that next week when we talk about assessment. But basically, when we're looking at intelligibility, we want to come up with a percentage, okay? So like I said, 2-year-olds should be 50% intelligible, 3-year-olds 75% intelligible, and by 4 and 5 years old, we want them to be 100% intelligible. Okay, but we could come up with percentages, and a lot of this, one has to do with recording progress, are children's becoming more intelligible with services, and 2, it does help in terms of making or providing data on whether a child is eligible for services. So we'll talk a little bit more about intelligibility next week when we go through assessment. Excuse me. Well, then we get into age of acquisition of speech sounds. And we have in the text, starting on page 91, a series of assessments or research that have been done looking at the age of acquisition, or when children should have a sound in their inventory. Okay, different assessments have used different criterion. So if you look at the first one on page 91, Dodholm and colleagues in 2003 used a 90% criterion. And what does that mean? Well, the children in their study, okay, they had to use the sound at least 90% of the time appropriately, okay, or 90% of the children in their total population had the sound, or produced the sound appropriately by this specific age, okay? So you'll see that across all of these, criterion are not specific. So some of the studies used 90% criterion, some of the studies used 75% criterion. So it's, whichever one you want to look at. But you'll see that for the majority of all the studies, there are similarities across the board. So most of the studies show that the early sounds that are developed and should be in a child's inventory are those front sounds, the b, j, n, w, d, p, h, and some have suggested that it comes in groups of 8. Schreiberg, actually, I think, is the one who did that. The next group of sounds, the middle sounds, according to Schreiberg, are t, n, k, g, f, v, ch, j, okay, j. And then finally, the late 8, which are those sounds that really do come in late. And this is what we typically will work on with kids, especially if we're working at school age. These are the sounds that you're working on. Your sh, f, s, z, v, o, and j. Okay? So those are the later developing sounds. And again, that's what we're mostly working on with children with speech disorders, or speech delays, I should say, in the school setting, at the school age. Okay, the other ones we're doing more at the preschool level and the early intervention level. Okay, so that's the general progression of when sounds are in our system. We often will see that children should really have appropriate use of vowels by the age of 3. So if a child is beyond the age of 3 and they're still having difficulty with vowels or discriminating in terms of their production of the vowels, then we may have an issue on our hands. Okay, that may be a deviant production. And that's something that we need to look at. Consonant clusters come in later, which makes sense, obviously. Then we get into age of acquisition, or I should say, age of suppression of our phonological patterns or processes. On page 99, we start with a chart of all the different processes, and they're often grouped into specific categories. So we have assimilation processes, substitution processes, excuse me, and these are just some of them, but you'll see a whole list of all the processes on the following pages. So this first chart does assimilation, substitution, and syllable structure processes. Assimilation, okay, or consonant harmony is what we'll often hear it called as, is when one sound is replaced by another that is the same or similar. So I talked about this in our vocabulary list with some of those words that we went through. But consonant harmony is when you produce one sound like another sound in the word. So the example here is the word dog is produced as dod, because that front d kind of overtakes the back g, and it's more easily produced when you're saying the word, and therefore you hear dod instead of dog. Again, these patterns are easier ways of producing words for children that may have difficulty, okay, producing the appropriate pattern or structure. Then we get into our substitution processes, okay, fronting, which is when we take our back sounds and produce them in the front. So velars are produced as typically alveolars. So this is tooties and milt instead of cookies and milk. That's my favorite example. We have gliding, where liquids L and R are replaced by a glide, wa or ya. So that's when rabbit is placed with wabbit, okay? And that's a process different than a child who can't produce the and is producing kind of like a neutral vowel, instead of So you'll get your kid that says wabbit for rabbit, and you'll also get your kid that says abbot for rabbit. Okay, and we'll talk more about that. And a lot of times when R in the vowel position, the vocalic R, is produced incorrectly, it's not necessarily that the child is gliding, it's that they have more of an articulation error in terms of production of the Stopping is next in our substitution processes, where fricatives or affricates are stopped. The air that should continue is stopped. So you hear the example here is sun is produced as ton. Okay? A lot of times you'll hear that in the final position of words. It'll affect actually morphology, right? Because final position we have S in plurals. We have it as a verb tense marker, and a lot of times kids that have this stopping will it will affect their morphology and syntax. Okay, and then finally depalatal. So palatal sounds are not produced as palatal sounds; they're produced further forward, more typically alveolar. So a sh is produced as a s, where we have the example fis instead of fish. And then the next category on the next page 100, we have our syllable structure processes, or phonological processes that affect basically the syllable structure of the word, including final consonant deletion. So the final consonant of a word is deleted. And again, here we go. If a child is producing these patterns, it's going to affect their syntax and their morphology, right? Because if they're not adding the final d in he kicked the ball, we're going to think he kicked the ball. Things such as that. That's a bad example because it has the final consonant cluster, but I hope you understand what I'm saying. And next we have cluster simplification or cluster reduction. And that's one we've talked about a lot already, where a cluster of consonants is produced more easily as just one of those consonants in the cluster. So example here, pain instead of plain. And then we also have weak syllable deletion. So that syllable that is not stressed is often deleted. So banana is produced as nana. Okay? We have ages of suppression when most children suppress these processes. Okay? When most children suppress them. Okay, you see that in the chart on page 101 and 102. Okay? And then the text provides us with some common mismatches or productions that are produced by children in error. For 2-year-olds, for 3-year-olds, for 4-year-olds, for 5 and 6-year-olds, right? So with the older kids, you see a lot of the consonant cluster changes, which makes sense. 4-year-olds, you'll see that the TH is produced as an F, which makes sense. The S is dentalized, so it's got that frontal lisp in a sense. Okay, and that's kind of nice, a nice chart to keep on hand to see if your child is doing what most kids typically do. Okay? And this, again, everything that we've been talking about is really in that phase 3 of mastery. Okay? Phase 3 of mastery in terms of speech sound acquisition. What phase 4 is speech sound acquisition or phonology and how it takes on the next level, that awareness level, that metalinguistic level, and how phonology impacts literacy. And this is where we talk about your phonological awareness skills, your ability to blend phonemes, your ability to segment phonemes, and things such as that. Things that we talked about last semester. Okay? So that's pretty much a overview of the text in terms of speech sound acquisition. Now again, this information, if we don't understand where a child should be typically, how are we going to understand if they're disordered or not? If they require therapy or not? If they require therapy, then what sounds should we work on? Do we work on the sounds that we know typically are acquired first? Or do we work on the sounds that may be more easily produced? Okay, so these are the questions that we have to come up with, or that we have to ask ourselves when we get into intervention. And if we don't have this basic knowledge of normal acquisition, it is not going to help us when we get to that point. Okay, and then finally, at what level do we discharge our children? Do they stop requiring services? Is it when they have acquired all of their sounds to 100%? Is it when they've acquired all of their sounds to 90%? Is it when they are intelligible, fully intelligible? Even if they're fully intelligible, they may have some speech sounds that are produced in error. Do they still require therapy? Right? So these are the questions that we have to ask ourselves, and this is how the knowledge of normal sound acquisition impacts our assessment and our intervention, and all the questions that we have that go along between the two. Okay, so that's where I'm going to leave it for now. Please read through the text, these chapters. Please read through. Please brush up on your transcription skills. Okay, and as you go through, next week we're going to go through assessment in class. Okay, and I believe that's chapter 6. So read up on chapter 6, so you have a idea of what we're going to be doing next week in class, and you can participate and contribute to our discussion and our hands-on experience as we look at different assessment techniques and how to assess children and what we're looking for when we assess children. Okay? Any questions, again, please feel free to get in touch. Thanks.